There's something about small towns, the kind of places where everyone knows each other's name, that hides a peculiar darkness. Maybe it's the isolation. Maybe it's the silence that settles over the fields after sunset. Or maybe it's because in a town that quiet, the screams don't travel very far. Tonight, we journey back to the 1950s, to a tiny town called Plainfield, Wisconsin. Population barely 600. A place so ordinary that no one thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked. Until one day, they wished they hadn't. Because beneath the calm exterior of that quiet town, a man was building something in secret. Something grotesque. Something that would redefine the meaning of horror. My name doesn't matter, but the story I'm about to tell you does. It's the story of Ed Gein, the man who turned his farmhouse into a monument of madness. Plainfield wasn't much to look at. Endless stretches of farmland, a single general store, and folks who smiled when they passed you on the road. But everyone knew Eddie. He was quiet, polite, awkward, sure, but harmless. The kind of man who helped fix your fence or babysit your kids if you asked. He lived alone after his mother died, kept mostly to himself. But every so often, people whispered. They said he talked to her, even years after she was buried. They said if you walked by his farmhouse at night, you could see the flicker of a lamp through the window and hear him laughing softly, as if someone was still in the room with him. Still, no one asked questions. In towns like Plainfield, people mind their own business. Until November 16th, 1957, when Bernice Warden, the local hardware store owner, vanished. Her son, Deputy Frank Warden, went to open the shop that morning and found the door unlocked, the register open, and a trail of blood leading out the back. On the counter there was a single receipt, made out to Ed Gein. Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies drove out to the Gein farm that night. It was snowing. The headlights cut through the darkness as they pulled into the long, unpaved driveway. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, half collapsed, the porch sagging under its own weight. The windows were black. No sound, no movement. When the deputies pushed open the door, the first thing that hit them was the smell. A thick, sour odor of rot and something far worse. Their flashlights swept across the cluttered room, old newspapers stacked to the ceiling, broken furniture, jars filled with things they couldn't yet recognize. And then, in the shed behind the house, they found Bernice Warden, hung upside down like a deer. Her body had been gutted. That was when the officers called for backup. What they discovered next would make national headlines. When investigators stepped inside Ed Gein's farmhouse, they thought they were walking into a junkyard. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, the junk began to take shape. And then, horror began to reveal itself piece by piece. On the kitchen table, a bowl made from a human skull. In the corner, a chair, its seat stretched with what looked like tanned leather. A lampshade patterned with skin. The deputies froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. I imagine one of them lifted a curtain and saw the outline of a face staring back. Only it wasn't alive. It was a mask, carefully cut from a human head. There were boxes filled with bones, organs preserved in jars, and belts sewn together from, you can guess. And in a cardboard box under his bed, the remains of at least 15 women. But here's what makes this story even stranger. Ed wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. Most of the remains didn't belong to victims he'd murdered. They were taken from graves. He confessed later that he'd spent nights digging up freshly buried bodies, bringing them home to keep him company. He wasn't killing for pleasure. He was building something. Behind a locked door at the end of the hallway, police found a room unlike the rest of the house. Clean, neat, almost sacred. It was his mother's room, untouched since the day she died. The sheets were still white, her clothes still hung in the closet. The air smelled of old perfume, faint but still there after all those years. He'd sealed it off from the filth of the rest of the house. To Ed, she was still alive, watching over him, and everything else he'd done was, in his own words, an attempt to become her. He'd been creating a woman's suit made of real skin so he could feel closer to his mother. When they arrested Ed Gein, he didn't resist. He looked almost relieved. He told the officers where to find everything, which graves he'd dug up, which pieces belonged to whom. He spoke with the calm of someone describing a grocery list. During questioning, he admitted to killing 2 women, Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who'd disappeared 3 years earlier. When they asked him why, he said softly, "She reminded me of my mother." Ed Gein's trial was brief. He was declared legally insane and sent to a mental institution where he spent the rest of his life. But the images from that farmhouse, the chair, the masks, the silence of that snow-covered property, they would stay in the minds of investigators forever. Even after Ed Gein was locked away, his story refused to die. The photographs from his farmhouse made their way into the hands of journalists, and then into the imagination of Hollywood. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. A quiet man, an overbearing mother, a house on a hill. The parallels weren't coincidence. Norman Bates was born from Ed Gein's shadow. Then came the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a grotesque symphony of rural madness, masks of flesh, and a family feeding on fear. Decades later, Silence of the Lambs reimagined him once more. Buffalo Bill, stitching skin together to become someone else. Each of these characters, each terrifying line of dialogue, was a reflection of one lonely man from Plainfield, Wisconsin, a man whose horror was real. But here's the truth most people forget. Plainfield was never a town of monsters. It was quiet, hard-working, normal. The real horror wasn't in the town. It was in the isolation, the silence that let madness grow unchecked. Every neighbor who'd waved to Ed, bought tools from his workshop, or seen him at the grocery store, thought he was odd, sure, but dangerous, never. He even babysat for some of them. That's what makes the story of Ed Gein so terrifying. Evil doesn't always wear fangs or grin behind a mask. Sometimes it looks like the quiet man down the road, the one who just keeps to himself. When Ed Gein died in 1984, the world didn't mourn him. They just wanted to forget. But even today, his legend lingers. In every horror movie, every ghost story, every whisper that begins with "based on a true story." And maybe that's why we tell these tales, to remind ourselves that the real monsters aren't born in nightmares. They're made in the quiet corners of the world we choose not to look at.